Well, good afternoon. Thanks everybody for joining us today, or good morning if you're joining us from the West Coast. I'm Holly Kuzmich, Executive Director of the Bush Institute here in Dallas. And we are glad to welcome you to our event on what makes smart immigration and border policy in the 21st century. This is part of our Engage at the Bush Center, sponsored by Highland Capital Management series. You know, the Bush Institute has been at work on immigration issues since our founding over 10 years ago, but we're particularly putting a focus on this issue for a whole variety of reasons. One of which significantly is the work our boss here at the Bush Center, President George W. Bush, is doing on immigration in his new book that will be coming out in April called Out of Many One, which is a series of portraits of immigrants that he has come to know, who have come to this country and contributed in ways to our society and our culture and our economy here in the United States. When that book comes out, we'll also be hosting an exhibit here at the Bush Center of those paintings and of all kinds of background and policy on immigration issues and why it's so important to our country, and helping people to understand this important issue a little bit better. Of course, we also in the Bush Institute work to advocate for immigration reform with policymakers in DC, and we'll talk a little bit about that today and what the priorities we see on immigration ahead of us. I'm joined by two of my great colleagues here at the Bush Institute. Laura Collins is a director of the Bush Institute SMU Economic Growth Initiative. She's got a long history on immigration issues, spent many years working in Washington, DC at the American Action Forum at the RNC. She previously worked in the Texas House of Representatives. And then I'm also joined by my colleague, Matthew Rooney, who's the managing director of the Bush Institute SMU Economic Growth Initiative. Matt is a former Foreign Service officer and has years of experience, a lot of that working with Mexico and Central America on key issues around our border and immigration. So Matt and Laura, thank you for joining me today. I'm going to kick off, Laura, with you. You know, we titled this, What Does Smart Immigration and Border Policy Look Like in the 21st Century? Because it's been a long time since we've had real updates to our overall immigration system. Can you paint the picture a little bit for how long it's been and why it's due for an update?
Sure. Thank you, Holly. Well, first I want to say, as you know, the Bush Institute thinks that America benefits from immigration. We think it's good for our economy. We think it's good for our culture. And that's really the perspective that we start with when we think about what good immigration policy looks like. How is it pro-growth? How does it enrich us? And one of the things that we really see with immigration in the United States is that we have a system that's woefully out of date. We haven't really had a fundamental update of the system since the mid-1960s, since the Immigration and Nationality Act was passed. We've had some updates in the 80s and in the 90s, but they didn't fundamentally reform the system. So what we have today is a system that still brings in the vast majority of immigrants based on family ties instead of employment. And overall, there just aren't enough opportunities, legal opportunities, for the immigrants who want to come here and contribute to do so. And so we really need to take a wholesale look, top to bottom reform of our entire system to make sure that it's working, that it's efficient, that it benefits America, and it's good for our economy.
Matt, what do you want to add there, just in terms of how you've seen, you know, a system that's so outdated and why it's ripe for reform?
Yeah, so certainly the inability of the system to provide our economy with the workforce that it needs is the core weakness from the point of view of American interests. I think we also have to acknowledge that the population of people who want to immigrate to the United States has changed significantly, certainly in the last 30 years, whereas at the beginning of that period, we were looking at essentially young working age Mexican men attempting to enter the country by any means possible, evade detection, and find ways to work in our country. Today, we find a crisis that's driven more by sort of a social and economic crisis in Central America that's driving families with young children to attempt to enter the United States. They don't want to enter illegally if they don't have to. Once they get into the United States, the first thing they do is seek out a Border Patrol agent so they can make a claim for refugee or asylum status. And so the infrastructure that we have set up, the personnel that we have deployed to the border are simply not suited to the population that they're encountering when they go about their business.
Okay, so our work at the Bush Institute, we've recently set out a series of policy papers diving into some of the particular issues related to immigration, because it's a deep and complex issue. And I want us to pretty quickly, but efficiently and comprehensively sort of talk through those different issues. I also want to highlight for everybody watching that we are going to leave some time at the end for any questions you have. So use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Send in your questions at any point during the conversation. And then later on in the program, we will get to as many of those as possible. So let's talk about some of the different aspects of our immigration system. What's the problem? What's the solution that we think is on the table? And what's been sort of the challenge that has really kept policymakers from advancing this issue? This is a big one, but we're first going to start with really how we update the system to meet the needs of our 21st century economy, and really work on reforming what we would call the legal immigration system. Laura, talk a little bit about, what's the challenge and what's the solution there?
Well, you laid out the challenge pretty clearly in that we don't really have a system that is built for our 21st century economy. So most immigrants who come here are legal, but most of them come based on their family ties. That's not to say that they don't contribute, but it is to say that they may not have the skills and education that meet the job openings we have. Our economy generates a lot of job openings. There's a skills gap for some part of the American population. And so you have a couple of options there. You can outsource, you can automate, or you can bring in labor to fill the open jobs that we have. And some of those jobs are not the sort of things that you can outsource or want to outsource, or that you could automate if you wanted to. So immigration is a good way to plug that hole in our economy. But because we have so many people coming on family-based visas, we really should think about rebalancing our immigration system to one where we have more green cards based on employment and skills. In particular, we really ought to consider how many of those are for people who are on a lower end, if you will, of the education or skills spectrum. These people are highly skilled workers, but their job categories really are not covered here. We really don't provide a lot of green card opportunities for people with less than a bachelor's degree. Those are people who can come here and contribute. They want to come here and contribute, and they want to do it legally. And so that's a place where our employment-based system could really expand. And continuing on that path, I think we also need to talk about what it means to have a good temporary worker visa system. Not everybody wants to come here and become an American. Some people really want to come here, work temporarily, and go home. And we need to have robust opportunities for that meet the needs of our market and that work on behalf, not just of American employers, but also of the prospective foreign workers. Attach those visas to the workers instead of to their employers. So they have the ability to go out and negotiate for better wages and make sure that they are most efficiently meeting the needs of our economy.
And Laura, what's been the real problem that's kept reform from happening to the sort of balance between family and employment-based immigration?
When we look at the attempts to reform the system over the last few years, one of the things that we see is that there is a couple of different tensions. One of them is the tension between comprehensive reform, one big bill that covers everything, and piecemeal reform, how to take this in small chunks and have Congress really work on individual pieces. And just the nature of compromise with members of Congress and how that works. Sometimes, issues that are smart can get bogged down in bigger bills. That's why you see some people advocating for piecemeal reform. That has its own challenge in terms of what trade-offs work really well together. The other thing we see is that when you're talking about future flows and rebalancing the immigration system to an employment-based system away from family, you're talking about picking winners and losers. That's really difficult for Congress to come to an agreement on. How many people should we bring in per year? How many more do we need to have to boost our economy and to help support our society demographically? And where should they be from? What does it mean to make those choices? And that's a really difficult question that Congress hasn't found a good middle ground on yet.
We're going to move, not that there's not a lot more to say on that issue, but I'm going to move us to the border and talk pretty extensively about the border. Obviously, we're all here in Texas. President Bush has always come to this issue with the lens of being a former governor of Texas. Talk a little bit about what challenges we're seeing at the border. Matt, you mentioned before the difference in terms of who we're seeing come to the border. Expand on this thought a little bit in terms of what we're seeing at the border. What are the challenges there today?
Yeah, so thinking a little bit about the driving factors, what we call the push factors that are present in immigration. What's unfolding in the what's called the Northern Triangle of Central America, that's El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. What's unfolding there is kind of a long-term, slow-motion economic and social and demographic crisis that has to do with the weakness of law enforcement agencies in those countries and the presence of very well organized, very well armed, essentially street gangs who transport narcotics across that region in support of the Mexican drug cartels in order to import those into the United States, or not import them, but smuggle them into the United States. And that institutional weakness and the fact that those police forces and the justice systems in those countries can't effectively enforce their laws has created a situation where common everyday people literally can't walk down the street in a city in Central America in safety. And as a result, many people find it impossible to live there and are seeking to leave. In addition, the economies of those countries, partly because of the security situation, for a number of other economic factors, they don't attract the investment that they need in order to create the jobs that they would need to have in order to absorb all the young people who are coming out of their schooling every year. And so you have two very powerful push factors: lack of economic opportunity and a lack of public security that is making many people reach the conclusion that their best bet is to try to enter the United States. And think about that for a moment. For those people with their young children to leave their homes, literally walk in many cases the length of Mexico, which is 2,000 miles, imagine reaching the conclusion that you're safer trying that than staying home. And so that is a powerful force that is driving these people to try to enter the United States. And so part of the answer has to be some response to those forces. Some of those programs are in place. Some money is being spent by the United States to try to strengthen those countries' economies, enable them to better attract investment, enable their law enforcement agencies to do a better job of enforcing the law. But it's a huge, huge challenge, and it's not going to be resolved overnight.
So Matt and Laura, in addition to that, and we do a lot of focus, we've put a lot of focus on those issues led by you, Matt, over the past couple of years here at the Bush Institute. But what can we also do in the short term to really manage the asylum seekers who are at the border? Laura, I'd be interested in your perspective on how we pair sort of this long-term strategy with the governments in the region, with the immediate needs we see on the ground.
Well, what you're really talking about is how are we flexible in the needs of what's going on at the border? How are we flexible with the needs of the people who are there? How are we flexible with our own security needs? And we talk a lot about how historically we had single Mexican men at the border trying to evade and come here for employment. And then we had this big wave of unaccompanied children from Central America, followed by families from Central America. And what we've seen in the pandemic is that's shifting again. And we are seeing more single Mexican men trying to cross. And that's just the nature of these push and pull factors. And so we ultimately need to build into the system flexibility to meet the next challenge, not necessarily the one that we just fought. And, how do we make that change? And how do we balance what we know to be good deterrence and enforcement policy that makes us more secure with a good legal immigration system that gives people opportunities to come here through legal channels? We know asylum is one of those legal opportunities, and it's a soft part of the immigration system. So people who wouldn't already have an opportunity to come here for employment might choose to try for asylum. They may actually be being persecuted in their home countries, but maybe their case doesn't rise to the legal level that we have here. But they're going to try asylum anyway, because it is a legal channel for them to come here. And it's important that we process those people quickly so that they know that the message is sent. If they aren't going to qualify, that they're going to be sent back home. And adjudication of these things is so important. And we don't have the resources in place at the border in order to make those claims quickly. We don't have enough immigration judges in order to make sure that those cases are in the system. And when you have a system where claims could take up to 2 years or longer, it just creates some inequities. You have people here who have valid asylum claims whose claims are held up because of the rush at the border. But you also have people who are literally waiting in tent camps on the Mexico side of the border just for a hearing, just so they can get in front of someone and plead their case. And so we really have a system that is not meeting the current needs, and it's not looking ahead to see what the next challenge is going to be.
So you all have talked about some of the solutions woven into your comments on this issue. Anything else you want to add, on how we even define what a secure border is based on all the work that we've done with experts on this issue?
So if I might, one thing I think is useful in this debate is I like to think of border security as a series of perimeters. And the United States is in a very fortunate position of being able to push our security perimeter far away from our physical border. Once a threat reaches the physical border, once a bad actor is at the border speaking to an American Border Patrol agent or a Customs and Border Protection officer, you've already lost in effect because that person is already inside the United States. So I think it's very useful to think of a series of perimeters. And the first perimeter is in Central America. There, it's not just a long-term play, it's a short to medium-term play. There's lots that can be done in terms of immediate law enforcement cooperation with those law enforcement agencies. Now, it's commonly objected at this point, oh, they're all corrupt, you can't work with them. It's true that corruption is widespread in those countries, but it's not literally true that they're all corrupt. There are ways to identify reliable counterparts in those police agencies and work with them on immediate short-term priorities, investigations, cases. There are things that can be done there. Mexico has traditionally done a poor job of securing its own southern border, its border with Guatemala. And so Mexico can do more there. More has been done in the last couple of years, but there's a lot more that can be done there. And then how Mexicans handle migrants that cross their own territory is another security perimeter for us. And then finally, there's our own physical border. And then as Laura says, there's the way we handle people once they've entered the United States and the way we apply our own laws, the rapidity and the efficiency with which we apply our own laws so that the proper signals are sent back down the chain that your prospects of being able to enter the United States successfully are small.
Yeah, Matt, you had a great quote about border issues and sort of how the public views this. You said that concern about the border is directly related to one's distance from the border. The further away you live, the more concerned you are about it. What do you think's behind that, and how do we kind of get beyond that feeling that sometimes enters into the debate when we're talking about border policy and security?
Yeah, that's of course with reference to how Americans feel about the border. And I've traveled around this country quite a lot, talking about these issues and dealing with public audiences about these issues. And when you're in, I don't want to tag anybody, but when you're in an American community far from the border, what you're dealing with is lack of familiarity and lack of understanding, and there's a fear that comes from that. And the general impression that's created by a lot of the media in the United States is that there's kind of an invasion, a wholesale invasion with large numbers of people crossing the border. And the fact is that when you're in a border community like El Paso, Texas, or Laredo, Texas, or Brownsville, Texas, you're in a community that exists across that border. People have family relationships across that border. Some people commute across that border. There are people that live in El Paso and operate factories in Juarez, and there's people that live in Juarez and commute to jobs in El Paso. And those are fully integrated, fully successful communities. And so the fact is that those people understand that border is necessary. It's a line between two countries that has to be defined. It has to be enforced. but it's not something. It's not something to be afraid of, and it's not a place where there's a wholesale invasion taking place. So I think a consciousness raising in communities away from the border is useful. I think. Ironically, on the economic side, in terms of trade, people far away from the border don't see the border as their problem, whereas the way things cross the border, the way our trade and our supply chains cross the border is actually crucially important to states and communities that are far from the border. Michigan is the second most dependent in terms of jobs among the states on trade with Mexico, second to Texas. And so the border is crucially important to those communities, but it's not something for them to be afraid of. And I think that's the message that needs to be communicated more widely inside our own country.
Yeah.
And also, if I may add, so much of how we talk about immigration matters. Tone matters so much on this. Your average migrant's not a security threat. They're here because they want to work, they want to obey our laws, and they want to contribute to their families and to our society. So, yes, are cartels a security threat? But if you look at the pattern of their violence and their illegal behavior, it's the vast majority of it stays on the Mexico side of the border, because they know that if they do that here, that we will find them, we will prosecute them, and we will put them in jail. And that matters. That strong rule of law really matters here. And so your average migrant is not a security threat. And so how we talk about that, and how leadership in your communities, we all have an obligation to make sure that we are being responsible and fact-based in how we talk about these issues. And that is one of them. These are human beings. They're not here to harm us.
Yeah.
And
okay.
If I could jump in again, sorry, may I jump in one more time and just say, you can see this, what the point Laura's making is really important. And you can see it in facts like El Paso, Texas is the safest large city in the United States, has the lowest rate of violent crime, and yet it is literally 10 feet away from Juarez, Mexico, which is an extremely sort of violent place. And so the fact is that the border is, in that sense, secure. The other thing that I think is interesting is I've driven in El Paso and in Juarez. I've driven in San Diego and Tijuana. You have to be very careful at stoplights in those places, because people often don't stop for stoplights in Juarez and Tijuana. A stop sign is kind of a suggestion, if it's not too much trouble, stop. Those very same people cross the border every day. And in El Paso, they stop for stoplights and they stop for stop signs. And so that sense that the law is going to be applied is extremely important.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about one of the really tough issues that every time we talk about, immigration reform is a real sticking point, and it's the undocumented population that is already here in the United States. Laura, paint the picture for that population generally, what the challenge is, and then what we are proposing as the solution there.
Yeah, so there are approximately 11 million undocumented people in the United States, and they're people that you probably interact with on a daily basis and don't even realize it. They're here, they're working, there are neighbors, and there are coworkers, and there are friends, and many of them have been here for a decade or longer. A lot of them have American citizen children. A lot of them came here legally and then overstayed a visa, whether that was intentional or whether they just had a paperwork issue, or maybe they lost a job and couldn't raise the funds to afford the fees. There's a lot of reasons that someone might be undocumented, but we know that they're here and that they're working and that they're paying taxes. If they're not paying property taxes and sales taxes like the rest of us, consistently we find about 50% of this population is trying to pay income taxes as well and files a tax return. They're not here because they want to take anything from us. They don't qualify for any federal entitlement benefits. They really are here to make a better life for themselves and to contribute to us. And so there has to be, a rational middle policy solution for them. What is reasonable? Are you going to deport 11 million people when, they're already here working? That's contracting our economy when you do that. Are you going to meet the reality of the situation? Find a way to help them comply with our immigration laws, paying back taxes if they owe them, proving up the taxes that they have paid, possibly paying fines and fees if that's appropriate, passing a criminal background check. We know most of them are probably not criminals. That would probably make your local news if they were all out, running amok of the law. So we know that they're by and large law-abiding people. So what is that reasonable solution to make sure that not only do they continue to contribute, but that we fully bring them into our society and into our civic participation, and really strengthen our communities that way. And so one of the things we propose is that reasonable solution, an earned pathway to citizenship, giving them the opportunity to prove that they deserve to be here and to put them on that path to eventual citizenship if they seek it. Just really strengthen those institutions and communities and make sure that we're fully bringing in these people to full participation in our society.
And then Laura, let's talk about dreamers a little bit, because this population has been living in limbo for a very long time. What's their status right now, and what needs to be done to give them some sort of permanent solution?
Well, for those who don't know, dreamers are undocumented immigrants who were brought here as children. So, they didn't actually break any laws because we don't hold children accountable for the actions of their parents. Right now, several of them, not everybody qualifies, but several of them have a sort of temporary status under Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which was an Obama era program that was challenged under the Trump administration and was reinstated by the Supreme Court. And what that does is allows them to temporarily live here with a work permit and to really sort of take those steps to becoming full Americans. We know that they're American in every way with their passport. And this program is still under attack. There's still a challenge that is active in the court system that could take this program away from these hardworking, for lack of a better term, Americans. They are Americans. So they really need a permanent legislative solution. Otherwise, they're going to be caught in this limbo, this back and forth. The next administration that could come in could decide to take this program away. This court case could take this program away. We really want to make sure that these people are not unnecessarily punished for the actions of their parents. They're here, they grew up here, they're fundamentally American, and they deserve the opportunity for their status to reflect that.
Okay, let's talk about a population. Let's make sure people understand sort of what this even means, but let's talk about the refugee population and how they fit in to our overall, immigration system.
Sure. Well, historically, America has done a pretty good job, not perfect, but pretty good job of being a leader on humanitarian immigration. And humanitarian immigration is basically, we have refugees and we have asylum seekers. And they're people who have fled their home countries, mostly due to persecution. And refugees apply when they're overseas. Asylum seekers come here and apply at our border, or they may be here on a visa and don't want to leave. And so they apply once they're in country. We really have this good tradition of being a welcoming society. America really views itself as a beacon of freedom and opportunity around the world. And so it's very important that we take a look at that, make sure that we are doing our part there to lead the world, to show the rest of the world what it means to be open to people who are fleeing persecution and oppression. We had a dip in the number of refugees that we were taking in annually under the last administration. This administration is taking steps to remedy that, and going forward, we'll bring in more in line with historical norms of the number of refugees that we resettle here every year. And I think it's really important to note, refugees, unlike other immigrants, aren't making a choice necessarily to come here. They really did want to stay home. But once they're here, they contribute. We know that they pay back all the things that were provided to them when they come here. They're required to, and they integrate fully into our communities and become very successful parts of this wonderful American fabric we have.
Okay, so I want to just ask you a quick kind of political strategy landscape question, then we're going to get to some of the questions that people have been sending in. The Biden administration has already outlined their plan to Congress on immigration. We saw legislation introduced last week in both the House and the Senate to carry that forward. But there's a lot of debate on the Hill right now about how to move forward. I think everybody pretty much recognizes that moving one comprehensive bill is not necessarily the way to go. But even in looking at moving some smaller pieces of legislation, many of them dealing with the undocumented, there's some pros to that, in that there's a good amount of support, especially for dreamers, to give them a path to legal status in the country, but it starts to get trickier the more that gets expanded. So Lauren, Matt, what are the pros and cons to this sort of piece by piece approach, and where do you see that going?
Well, I'll start. The pros to the piecemeal approach is that you might have some pieces of legislation that are achievable and viable, particularly when we think about a legislative solution for Dreamers, because that's been something that's been in front of Congress several times. We know it's popular in the public. And so if it doesn't get too bogged down in some of the other pieces that Congress needs to fight about, maybe it will have a chance. The real downside to that, though, is that then you still have to reform the rest of the system, because we know just one piece of this is enough. We know 2 or 3 pieces. There are other pieces of legislation that are moving. In Congress, we know that that's not enough. It's not going to fix the underlying problems in the system. So legalization is nice. It's a good thing for the populations that will benefit from it. It's even a good thing from America. We will benefit from having the undocumented population legalized, essential workers, and temporary protected status people as well. But it's not going to fix the underlying parts of the system that are broken. And if we don't fix that, we're just going to end up in this situation again in the next decade or 2, trying to, once again, unwind and figure out how to fix a system that's just not working.
Okay, I'm going to get to a couple questions, and I'm going to paraphrase a couple of these and combine some of them that have come in on similar topics. This first one is related to President Biden and some of the political chatter that's going on in relation to some of either the policy changes he's made, the executive orders he's put in place or rescinded from President Trump, or his overall immigration plan. This sort of perception that we're moving to open borders. How factual do you think that is? And what's really happening?
The main thing that has changed so far under this administration is the tone. A lot of the things that were in place via executive order from the Trump administration that either slowed down immigration or really prevented people from coming here during the pandemic, those things are still in place. And a lot of people, I think, are worried because we've seen that the Biden administration is taking steps to unwind the Remain in Mexico program. And so they've let a few asylum seekers in. What they are doing is simply following the processes that exist. And they're doing it slowly and methodically. And this is not going to be just a rush on the border. I think that you really will see them making a big effort to do this in a way that is responsible and tries to make sure that we balance those security concerns. But I understand that, this is when you've had a border, particularly in a pandemic, that has been fundamentally shut down. It is scary to say that we're going to have thousands of asylum seekers come in. What does that mean? What is that, what message does that send to other people who want to come here? And what we really know from the data is that ultimately the policies don't impact that much about whether people come here or not. The biggest pull factor the United States has is our economy. We have a good economy, even in this pandemic-induced recession. And the biggest push factors are not things that we really have control over. You've seen in Central America, not just the corruption and the violence, but also in the fall, there were some natural disasters, hurricanes, displaced people entirely. So, the tone has changed a lot. A lot of the policies from the prior administration are still in place. And it remains to be seen how much the Biden administration will unwind those policies. But again, it's not an open border situation. We really are still fundamentally shut down on legal immigration at this point.
Okay, another question came in asking your point of view on whether, we talked a little bit about the legal immigration system and employment-based and shifting a bit of focus from family-based to employment-based. One of our attendees asked, is a point-based system for skilled immigrants similar to what we're seeing in the UK, the best way to replace what he calls our random draw green card system in a way to better address the gaps we have in our economy?
A lot of people like a points-based system, and you will see some other think tanks who advocate for that. I know notably Doug Holtz-Aiken at the American Action Forum has a plan for a points-based system that he thinks would work well. It would be a big shift in the United States to move to a points-based system. I don't have any strong feelings one way or the other about it. If it can accomplish what it is that we want to accomplish on rebalancing, then I think it's worth a look. But it would just, it would be a huge shift and would require, I think, a lot of political will to get that done.
Yeah. Matt, I'm going to direct this question to you. There's a question about, it says there's been recent talk about drug cartels at the border influencing immigration. Can you talk about the connection between those issues or not? Sort of how do those issues influence each other, both in the actual what you see and then in the conversations that often happen on this issue?
Yeah, so I think it's useful to think about them, what we refer to as the Mexican cartels. It's useful to think of them as sort of a trucking company. They're transportation enterprises. They're not producers of narcotics by and large. They move stuff. And so they move any illicit cargo across Mexico and to the US border, and then they try to move it across the US border. So when there are people who want to enter the United States without proper documentation in violation of our laws, that becomes a product that the Mexican cartels can move, and they do. So there's a whole industry that exists in Central America and in Mexico to help these people move across Mexico and try to help them to get into the United States. So it's certainly true in some abstract sense that the Mexican cartels influence immigration. It's also true, I think, that certainly there are organizations, illicit organizations in Central America that are telling people, you should move to the United States. You should come to the United States now because this is your opportunity. That's the real danger, in a way, of the talk about open borders in the United States, is Central Americans hear that as, oh, this is my opportunity. And there are people there telling them, for $3,000, I can move you across Mexico and get you into the United States. And this is your opportunity before they clamp down or while this more open attitude is in place. And so those factors are definitely there. And there are, if you look at how the Mexican cartels are sort of structured, there are several that are focused on major Mexican cities on the US-Mexico border. So there's a Tijuana cartel, there's a Juarez cartel. And the reason why those cartels survive in that very localized form is because their specialty is getting stuff across the border. And they use a whole variety of ways of doing that. They've got, false bottoms in gas tanks. They've got, trucks that are set up with concealed compartments to try to evade detection when they cross the border at a port of entry. They have tunnels, in urban areas, especially out in San Diego, Tijuana, where the border isn't a river. They have tunnels. Sometimes some of the tunnels 3, 4, 5 miles long that go under the border and emerge in a warehouse on the US side. So those are definitely factors. And in fact, to me, one of the main arguments from the US perspective for reforming immigration law and creating pathways for people to enter the United States legally to do things that we as Americans want to have done, jobs we want to have filled that we're having a hard time filling with our own workforce. One of the main reasons to do that is to take that illicit traffic away from the cartels and deprive them of that opportunity to prey on the misery that's represented by these people trying to leave their homes and to exploit these people, because it's not like they have a nice air-conditioned bus that drives these people to San Diego. The fact is they walk, they sleep outside, the women are subject of sexual violence, people are robbed. It's a terrible, terrible violation of these people's humanity. And the only reason it happens is because there's no other way for these people to enter the United States. And so I think that's one of the really powerful reasons to reform this whole system, is to take that line of business, as it were, away from the cartels.
Yeah. So one of the questions came in, I know this is an easy one for you all, but it gives you an opportunity to expand a bit when we gave this short script earlier. Their question is about border security, saying immigration reform will never be a solution without securing the borders from illegal entries and visa overstays. Will you be supporting an all of the above approach to border security on the land borders, including technology, physical barriers, biometric entry and exit, maintaining a robust CBP and ICE law enforcement? How do you see the linkages between those, and what have we advocated for on our coming out of the Bush Institute?
Well,
So if I might, that's a great opportunity. Sorry, if I might, it's a great opportunity to plug our paper, because we just published today, actually, a paper that addresses those essentially those questions, and actually does adopt an all of the above approach, and adopts the approach that I outlined earlier of a series of perimeters. And so as long as we define all of the above as literally everything, which starts with law enforcement cooperation in Central America and Mexico, includes physical barriers where that makes sense along the US-Mexico border, drones, sensors, other technologies where a physical barrier is not cost effective, more flexible deployment of American law enforcement personnel, all of those things that create that perimeter, and the domestic reforms, then that is exactly the approach we've taken in our paper. Sorry, did I take all that? I took your fire away from you, Laura.
No, I mean, that's exactly what I was going to say. And I was actually just going to thank the person who asked the question for teeing it up for us so we could tell you what is in this paper that we've worked very hard on. We didn't just come up with this on our own either. We had a working group of people who we consider to be good thinkers and experts on this, people who have either worked in politics before on these issues or worked in policy, some who worked in government, and people who live along the border, to really get to the heart of what it is that is workable and practical and flexible. Again, going back to that point about flexibility, you have to have flexibility along the border so that you can adapt to what the next challenge is going to be. We're really proud of this. We hope that you'll take a look at it. And we really think that we need a new approach to border security, and one that is an all of the above solution and focuses on all of the real challenges we face.
So Laura, we got a couple questions about the undocumented. One was, how do they actually go about paying taxes, right, if they don't have a legal Social Security number? And then number two is, what exactly are immigrants, whether they've got legal status or no legal status? What are they eligible for in terms of benefits within the United States?
We'll take the tax one first. So if you are an undocumented person, you may pay taxes through what they call a tax identification number. You don't have to have a Social Security number to file an income tax return. In terms of benefits, legal immigrants on green cards who have been here for at least 5 years qualify for federal entitlement benefits, just like an American citizen would. So things like Medicare or Medicaid if necessary. But if you're not here on a legal status, you don't qualify for any of it. I think the most that you get is probably emergency Medicaid, because if you show up at an emergency room, a hospital's not going to deny you care. You might see some WIC programs because, again, there's a public policy reason for that, right? You don't want children to starve. And so we want to have that program available to make sure that we are ensuring that children have the ability to thrive. But in general, they're really not entitled to anything. And so, they're here operating many times on the margins of society, being paid fairly low wages because of the types of jobs that they can get as undocumented people are not the sort of jobs that pay high wages. And they're doing so without the social safety net that the rest of us have.
Okay, well, Laura and Matt, we are at time for today. Thank you for this robust discussion. Thanks for the great questions we got from our audience today. We actually got a question. They want to make sure they can find our paper on border policy. So I'm going to put a plug in, go to www.bushcenter.org, and you will find our policy recommendations, as well as a series of 5 policy papers on some of the deeper issues in immigration reform. We're obviously going to keep pushing hard to advance public policy solutions on this really thorny but important issue. As I mentioned, you'll be seeing more from us over the coming months. President Bush's book, Out of Many One, comes out April 20th, and our exhibit here at the Bush Center in Dallas will open in April. So thank you, everybody, for tuning in today, and thank you, Laura and Matt. We'll see you all.
Thank you, Holly.